Hello, everybody. This is Bradley Grunner of A Male Space, and today I'm here with Suviya. And Suviya has a TikTok channel in which she addresses men's and women's issues. Can you tell us what the name of that channel is?
Yeah, it's actually just my name. So it's Suviya, and it might be Suviya Fawn. So I go back and forth just depending on whether I can get just Suviya on its own. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That's right. So okay. So what brought you to? I We met on X, and I kept on seeing your posts, and we eventually became connected on X. And I was
Sure.
seeing your posts as they relate to men's issues, or what people call intersexual dynamics in the current day. So, what brought you to this topic?
Yeah, great question. I mean, because there's not a whole lot of women in that space, I don't feel like. Um, and what brought me into it is that I've always kind of been interested in male issues. Growing up, I was highly ADHD, so I kind of suffered some of the same fate as my male counterparts in school. It doesn't make it very easy to make female friends when you kind of, when you have those kinds of issues and you're kind of getting in trouble quite a bit. Later, I became a teacher and I was able to see some of the issues firsthand that really divide the male and female population. And it starts a lot younger than I think a lot of people realize. But I only started speaking out about a year ago. I have a teenage son and I have a preteen daughter. And so I could really see the issues starting to affect their generations, especially if you looked into it. Gen Z is having terrible, terrible luck when it comes to dating, marriage, having children. And so the birth rates are dropping off the map, marriage rates are dropping off the map. It's one of those things that their generations are going to be heavily, heavily impacted by these things. And so, about a year ago, and it'll be a year in September, I started my TikTok channel and I really started to speak out about men's issues because I just don't feel like there are a whole lot of people that are listening at this point. I think maybe it's getting a little bit better, but I feel like not that men need women to speak up for them, but I do feel like with feminism being the way that it is and women being so hard to kind of get through to on these issues, I do feel like it may take a lot of women speaking up about these things and getting other women to really listen and realize what they're doing and what's happening. So
Well, that's very good that you are addressing this as a woman because, as you know, I've been addressing much of what Dr. Stephen Baskerville has been saying about this issue and the marriage strike and the decreasing birth rate. Is that the way that this is going to work is men and women working together. If men are going to strike from marriage and strike from reproduction, then the only way that we get through this is by working together because of various factors that perhaps are going to go through here. So, uh, with feminism, I delved into feminism as part of my, let's say, quote, going down, the term rabbit hole of going into men's issues. Obviously, I came across feminism and started to educate myself about feminism. And there is so much to go through with feminism, the various authors and prominent influencers going back longer than many people think. I mean, feminism goes back way farther than the sexual revolution of the 1960s. People think it goes back to only then. They think of Gloria Steinem, they think of Betty Friedan, but then I say to myself, after educating myself, I say, wait, this is going back a long time already. And it seems to me that people really, when they think of feminism, as I've said in my notes that I share with you, is that they immediately think of two things immediately that comes to mind. The people, and I'm not trying to make them feel silly because I have some knowledge now about it now. I have nowhere near the knowledge I want to have about it, such as Dr. Janice Firmengo, who has, she seems to be the most prominent expert on feminism, the history of it, and what it actually is that they first go to voting rights and working. And then when I ask such people, let's say that's what they think that feminism is, I'll say, have you read any feminist literature? Can you name a feminist author? And they can't even name one. And they do not know anything about feminism besides the right to vote and besides being pretty much nudged or exhorted to go into the workplace. Do you notice that also that when people are talking about feminism, they have no idea what the feminists have been saying or pushing for? That's not really what
it's
feminism is.
sorry, it's funny that you say that because one of my favorite things to say is that nobody misunderstands feminism better than feminists. I feel like the majority of them don't understand what it actually is. They don't understand what it's actually doing, what any of the real ideals of feminism are. And they get stuck on, like, just like you said, equality. It's all about equality, or it's all about, I just don't want to lose my right to vote. Yeah, you should be thanking a feminist that you're online and able to even speak out on these issues. And those are kind of silly things to say because, and feminists hate me when I point this out, but feminists really didn't give us those rights. If men hadn't decided that we were correct on some of these things, we
Yes.
would still not have those rights. So really, we owe men a debt of gratitude for the rights that we do have. And, I think a lot of feminists get offended by that. But again, that's kind of just the MO of feminists, is to be offended by certain things, even if they are truthful. And so that makes things very hard to talk about. It makes discussions very difficult, and it makes getting to the bottom of these issues almost impossible, because you have that very visceral reaction out of a lot of, not even just feminists, but out of women in general, because of the way that we're, kind of programmed, if you will, over time to feel like we're being jilted by certain things. And so if men say something, I'm sure you've noticed it in your own life, women will automatically react, even if they don't really understand why they're reacting in that certain way. And I think that's one of the things that kind of brought it to my attention, because I've never been a feminist, but even I have fallen prey to these things because, again, it starts very early. It starts early on in school. Then you also have societal impacts. And so you really are kind of programmed into a certain mindset by the time you're an adult. And I would find myself kind of getting upset with my fiance, and I'm a little bit different than a lot of women, just in the way that I have had ADHD my entire life. I have always been one of those kind of analytical children. Well, if you know any analytical children, that is, I guess. That's probably pretty strange in itself. But growing up, I had a lot of neuroses. I had a lot of anxiety. So I was always kind of in a state of panic, and to kind of get myself through those types of things, I would have to assess situations like, okay, well, what are the actual odds? And my mom taught me this, because when you have a child who's going to panic over everything, you have to teach them some coping mechanisms. And so, one of the things I would do is, when something would be scary and I'd feel myself about to panic, I would have to sort of take a step back and say, okay, what are the odds that this is actually going to happen? What are the truths about this situation, and what are just things that I'm making up on my own? And so I think because I've done that for such a long time, it makes it a little bit easier for me to take a step back from situations, even ones that affect me or involve me, and kind of say, okay, what is the actual truth about this situation, and what is something that really isn't true, and why am I having this kind of reaction? And so when you do those types of things, you realize that sometimes you're just reacting because you're supposed to react, you think, in your own mind. And so when you get down to it, it's like a lot of those things are just kind of silly, and they don't make any sense. And so that kind of set me on a path of trying to figure out, well, why do we think these certain things? Why is this the way that we're all kind of taught? And one of my most frustrating lies of feminism is the lie that if we didn't have feminism, women would be being abused by their husbands, like en masse. And I think that that's a very effective lie that feminists tell to women, because, no one wants to be abused. And when you don't have all the facts, and you're told that this certain situation was commonplace at a certain time because feminism wasn't there to protect you, you're going to believe those things, and you're going to react accordingly when it comes to interactions with your significant other, when it comes to defense of feminism, thinking that you need to have it around. So
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Have you that everything? I mean, everything you said is on point, I believe, and I can relate to that. For example, going through certain challenges with certain conditions, and I have in previous videos said that I had certain conditions also that kind of I believe that I'm inherently empathetic, but then again, some challenges in my life did make me think about others to a degree and what they're going through, and not to personalize everything. So, with that said, do you notice that there are, well, first of all, I want to say this is that there were social changes that were already taking place for women to be elevated in society, for
Mhm.
example, being educated or having the right to vote, and also throughout European society going back many, many, many years, even in pagan societies before Christianity, women were held in high regard. So
Mhm.
this whole notion that that women were oppressed and abused and hated by men in the West, I cannot. I'm a person living in the West. I do not know the history of all countries, but from what I know, that is the case actually. And also, with that said, my view, considering my education on the topic, my self-education, is that what Dr. Daniel Amneas and Stephen Baskerville has said, and I could see it in the writings of feminists, it's congruent, is that the two tenets of it really are not so-called rights or empowerment. It really is at the forefront one, unbridled sexual freedom, and two, 100% control over the reproductive process, which is
Mhm.
why abortion, and that's a whole other topic. I don't want to get into that whole thing. People get very sensitive over that also. If we're going to get sensitive about that, I'd rather make possibly, not definitely, a whole other video about that.
Mhm.
Probably not going to. However, that's what I understand about feminism, whether we are going to have abortion or not. That's the two tenets. And what I've noticed also, with that being said, is that there is a great deal of contradiction in feminism, meaning that on the one hand, if you see in feminism, there's this like you said, this notion that men are out to abuse women, and if a woman did not want, was not 100% in the mood for, sexual activity at the time that she had, did the deed with percent into it, and maybe
Mhm.
you just did, let's say, uh, went through the motions in some cases, which couples do sometimes, they were calling it that. But
Mhm.
also, there seems to be this contradiction, meaning that I've noticed amongst the feminist writers and influencers that they say those bad things about men, but then some of them as individuals were involved with the most power hungry, psychopathic men personally. Like
Mhm.
they think this way about men, but the men that they do like are not good men. And I'm not saying that to virtue signal, saying I'm a saint or something, but pretty much speaking, most of the men that they are around are very power hungry and not nice men. And there's even, I'm not going to mention names because I'm not into spreading drama and e-beefs and hostility online. Even if you see on X where you and I were conversing and met, that even the so-called rad femmes there, when they, let's say, list or post a photograph of a man that they're attracted to, some of them will say, look, he's evil. Look at that wicked
Mhm.
smile. Do you notice these contradictions? Because even feminists like Barbara Seaman and Delma Hain, they urge women to be promiscuous. They urge women to cheat on their husbands, like flat out,
Yeah.
cheat on your husband. Do you notice that?
Yeah, I have. I really have it. And it's interesting to one of the things that a book that I read, which was Rachel Wilson. I'm sure you probably are familiar with her husband,
Yes.
Andrew Wilson. You're probably even familiar with her, maybe. But they make appearances on the Whatever podcast here and there. And she wrote a book called Occult Feminism, and it's interesting to me because it delves into some of the historical links of feminism. And this is kind of something that I stumbled upon myself because I always relate things to ancient history. I always feel like, especially when it comes to relationship dynamics, I feel like if we really want to understand how male and female are supposed to work with one another, or how we're supposed to kind of function on this planet, then you want to look to those ancient examples because when you put yourself in the position of like prehistoric male and female, they had to work in certain ways together in order to survive. That's obviously the design of man and woman is to complement one another, kind of be the pieces of one another that the other one is not, and also create balance with one another. And so when you look to those historical examples, you go down all sorts of kind of rabbit holes, like what you were talking about earlier. But one of them was ancient temple prostitution, and so that was something that she focused on in her book that I found really, really interesting because we seem to be kind of reliving this now, if you will, in the form of OnlyFans or pornography, if you will, because that is very much female controlled. These women are choosing, they're opting to do these
Yes.
things, and it kind of makes no sense when you think about it in through the lens of what a feminist really should do. But feminists seem to defend it tooth and nail, and that's interesting to me. And it kind of reminds me of temple prostitution. That was also female run, and just prostitution in general. It was one of those things, they call it the oldest profession because it's the oldest profession outside of the norms, right? It's outside of what you were like actually supposed to be doing, and it's the oldest profession that you could control on your own. You could go off and make money on your own, maybe working with someone else, but you could do it on your own if you had to. And that's how a lot of women have survived throughout very, very dark times in history. And it's interesting to me because what temple prostitution and what OnlyFans is it's women exploiting themselves and other women. And that's interesting to me because if you are a champion of women and protecting women and girls, you should absolutely hate things like OnlyFans because it opens up this window for all sorts of exploitation, and not only exploitation, but also abuse of vulnerable and younger women. And so it's interesting to me that we see these kinds of things where women are sort of saying one thing, but they're doing another. They're making sure that these avenues for women and girls to be abused and exploited are still open, but yet they're going to say that they don't agree with those things. And it's the same thing when it comes to dating. You see these women that are attracted to like these bad boys or these criminal elements, and you wonder why. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the nature of humans. Ancient females had to find a mate that was going to protect them, that was going to
Yes.
be able not just to protect them, but also be able to secure an area or a lifestyle, be able to make sure that their offspring was going to be able to survive as well. Make sure that you're going to be able to, create all these provisions and things that are going to be more long term because he's not always going to be there. And so I think that an element of that is that you want to find someone who has a little bit of that kind of survival instinct, if you will. They're willing to sacrifice other people's well-being for the benefit of you and your offspring. And so I think that some of that kind of comes from nature, where we're looking for this certain element, but we've confused it so much over the years because we are saying that we don't want that anymore. We don't want to be controlled. We don't want this overbearing, toxically masculine man, but yet that's still flowing through us, where we are trying to find that because we inherently know that that's what we're supposed to be. That's what can keep us alive. That's what can keep us protected. And so I think that that's a lot of what we have here, where we see these women saying, I don't want this. I think that men are evil because they commit this much of the crime, and they commit these heinous acts, but yet they turn around and go for some of the most dangerous or criminally inclined men that are out there, and that makes absolutely no sense. But it does when you think about how they're trying to change their own nature, but nature is going to continue to keep coming back calling. So
Well, I'm actually very thankful that you said that because you actually answered a question that I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about this element of attraction in women. And like I've been saying, and to my audience, yes, I'm going to be repetitive much of the time. I'm going to keep on referring to the same authors over and over and over again because I believe that these authors that have moved me are the most level-headed authors giving us the information about how to deal with the situation. So I'm always recommending that men who are interested in this topic to read the essay by Roger Devlin called The Question of Female Masochism, in which he addresses exactly what you said and also the evolutionary origins of it. And he does address the fact that women are not all women, but many women, I think most of them, are not going to simply say, yes, I like him because he's like this. They're going to say something else, meaning that he had confidence or he had a swagger or I was tricked. He seemed confident, something like that. And I sometimes I just want to say, look, just say what you like. Just say it already. You don't have to be embarrassed around me or other men. The cat's out of the bag. The toothpaste is out of the tube. We all know this already. Why do you keep on hiding this? Just say. I'm not going to say all women, but just say you like mean men, deviant men, brutal men, criminal men, whatever, antisocial, whatever, or psychopathic. You could just say this already at this point. And even other men say this. I even see some of the conversations online that I've had in certain forums that I've been on, even some of the bodybuilding forums that have like off topics, and that sex is such a popular topic these days. Mating, dating, marriage, sex, and some of the men will even say, no, it's really that it's the confidence. You could be not one of those guys that have the confidence, but they go for those guys because they have the confidence. I go, no, 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 no. Women understand the difference between this. They understand who is actually like that. What do you think of that? I mean, women know what they want, right? I mean, can we just say this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that women definitely seem to understand because, like you said, they're saying one thing, but they're doing another. So clearly, they understand what they're actually interested in, what they actually want. And another piece of evidence towards this is romance novels. Romance novels, if you can even call them romance novels anymore, I mean, they're a little bit extreme, and they go into a lot of this element of sexual sadism, even if you
Yes.
will. And it's interesting because you would never find a woman on the street who would say that she's interested in that sort of thing. Yet you have films and books that are flying off of the shelves that prove otherwise. And so it's interesting to me because I think that a part of this is because of women's propensity to conform. We know what other people want to hear as well. And so we know that society as a whole is going to kind of shame those types of behaviors. And so you're not going to come out right out and say, oh, I like him because he's a total deviant, because that other people are going to judge you for that. And that's not one of the things that's protected by feminism. There are certain deviant behaviors that are protected by feminism that you can say, oh, I like this because, or I'm interested in
Yes.
this because, but that's not one of them. And I think it kind of goes back to the whole men are the enemy sort of thing, where you can't say that you're scared of men. You can't say that you're in fear for all these things and have all these protections in place and privileges in place if you admit that you actually like men who are like that. So it's one of those
Yes.
things where it's a kind of a catch-22 where, and this is throughout feminism. There is no way to be a feminist, if you ask me, and not be completely delusional or just, it's like Schrodinger's from a feminist, where you are both victor and victim. You can't be both of those things. Either you're oppressed or you're not, and so it's one of those things where they want to have it both ways because that's the only way that it really works. You can't say, I want to be with a man who understands women, who is, considerate of my feelings and my needs, and also say that you want, this kind of bad boy persona, because those two they don't mix well. And so you have to sort of keep that a secret and make sure that you're putting on one sort of face while in the background you're at home reading romance novels where all kinds of deep depraved things are happening.
Yes, it's interesting. Yes, I get exactly what you're saying, and I'm glad that you're saying this as a woman and being so candid and transparent about it, because you seem to be a transparent, honest woman, and are not hiding these elements of attraction. And also, even if you look at the covers of this romance novel, the woman is usually in a subservient position. I mean, you'll see
Mm-hmm.
a warrior. You will see even on some of the covers a Bigfoot like. I'm talking about a creature
Mm-hmm.
here, like a Bigfoot or like a minotaur or like a centaur, like monsters carrying women around. And that doesn't depict the quality in that cover. That depicts subservience, submission, ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting. And anybody can go to Amazon.com and search for these novels and see the covers, or something. I remember seeing one novel called "The Billionaire," I believe, and it wasn't a picture of a nice man. It was picture, it was what I'm talking about. That's the theme. So now that I would like to go on to further our talk about feminism, I have my outline here. Um, okay, so have now, what do you think? Now, you see, we even went to this actually, and sometimes when I'm doing this and trying to follow my outline, the flow of the conversation forces, not
Mm-hmm.
forces, I will go kind of around this because it leads into other topics that I wanted to address later, but I'll address them now, or what comes to my head. So, um, even you and I came back to what women are attracted to. And obviously, I want to say this to the audience that not everybody has to be a criminal or a bad guy to have a wife and kids, because I'm not sitting in a prison cell myself and I have two children and a wife. None of my friends are like that. But we're just talking about a general trend here.
Mhm.
Now, do you think that being on X, and I've noticed this also, and I've been asking my other interviews about this, other guests on my channel so far, is that there seems to be this, and this obsession is very common in the X spaces. And have you been in any of the X spaces, people discussing these topics? Uh,
I host some X spaces, but I have kind of a humble following on X, so I don't have a whole lot of people that get in there. I've tried to listen in on a few other X spaces that deal with these kind of topics, but it seems like, sometimes they get all over the place. They don't really stick to the topic, and so, you know, I'll end up leaving before very much gets done. So I haven't been in a whole lot of them that deal with these issues, but
okay, well, I see. So, being that I've only been in a few of them and sometimes listened, I'm just curious what's out there on different forms of social media, whether it be YouTube, Instagram, what people are saying and what they really want to say because they cannot say all their thoughts. These are topics that you really can't have a casual conversation about with your family and friends or at a bar somewhere. But people are using the internet to exchange ideas on these topics that are very pressing towards us. The topics generally go to even what you and I are discussing here, besides feminism. It goes right to sexual attraction. And it's his obsession. Sometimes I've been in some of these spaces, and it goes right to the analysis of female attraction. How dating? How do women really like height? Is it really status? Is it really money? Is it this? I was dating this woman, and this happened. This woman that, and it comes to completely, as I've said to my other guests on my show, is that it becomes just simply a big uh, bitch and moan fest, whining and whining and whining and yammering and whining and whining, and actually putting much of it is also centered around putting down women. That the woman is like this and the woman is like that, and again, this over analysis of what attracts women. Now, I think that this is not normal. For example, I'm what they would call a zennial, somewhere in between Gen X and millennial. And people did not analyze attraction back then. You simply got out of your house and you went somewhere. And because people socialized a lot outdoors, you simply went to the park, you went to other social events, parties, etc. And there were women there. And that was it. And a man would ask out a woman, and there. And if they got along, maybe they would form this so-called relationship. And I'm always going to put relationship in quotes here, and I will tell you why later, or sooner or later, or let's say they went on to be married. No analysis, no obsession. Do you think there's a reason why there's this obsession right now? Because I think the obsession comes from the lack of attraction between the sexes, or the difficulty to find mates these days, to me, is a symptom of a broken society. We shouldn't have this much analysis. To me, this is a symptom of a broken and atomized society in which people are simply not getting together through normal means anymore. What do you think?
yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that a lot of it has to do with, I mean, we're a very visual society these days. We go online, a lot of dating is happening online, and so it's a lot of what you see at first glance. And I was actually discussing this the other day with someone where there was this whole phenomenon where women weren't seeing men that they were attracted to, and it led to this whole idea of the chopped man epidemic, or whatever you want to call it, where they're saying that either men just aren't trying to look attractive, or men are getting increasingly less attractive. And to me, it's very silly because, first of all, in my opinion, I don't think, and I'm not saying that men are unattractive, but when you think about the way that men and women look, the features, the form, overall, even women prefer to look at other women. And so it's one of those things where it's just a prettier composition. It's a more, and I don't know if that's a natural thing or if that's something that we've caused over time because of our obsession with reproduction. But the female form and feature seems to be more of an eye-catching aspect, when you're looking for something. And so I don't know that men have ever been super stunning to where you walk into a crowded room, and at first glance you're going to see Mr. Perfect that's just like shining out there in the crowd. That's just not kind of the way that it has ever worked. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're not supposed to be. You know what I mean? We're created for different functions and features. And so men are created with strength. They have strength and agility and stamina, whereas women, we're not going to be able to get a mate by being the strongest or by being the most capable of, creating provisions. We're going to get a mate by being the one that you notice in the crowd, or the one that you are just attracted to at first glance. And so I think part of it is because they're just not they're not built to be they're not built to be attracting a mate by their stunning beauty. They're meant to be attracting a mate by, this is what I'm able to do. And women are just the opposite. And I think that we've got these things confused. Like, we forget that we're not a modern creature, we're an ancient creature. And so those things that are roadmaps that are built in within us are going to still be there, and they're still going to be guiding us, and we can't just pretend like things are not the way that they are. And so I think that it's interesting because we have this whole phenomenon where people are going online and seeing a picture and swiping and swiping and swiping, and you're not getting to know the person. And I don't know about you, but I've met lots of people in my life where I may not have thought that they were all that attractive at first, but then I started talking to them, I got to know them. And you see it all the time in movies too. You see it where it's the kind of the, I don't know, dorkier guy or whatever that the cheerleader would have never noticed off the for at first glance, but she starts, through one reason or another, she starts talking to him, gets to know him, and by the end of the movie, she finds him extremely attractive. And so it's one of those things where he didn't change, his attractiveness didn't change, but you actually got to know him, and that made him more attractive to you. And I feel like that's one of the things that we're missing in a lot of relationships, because if we're going out at all, we're going out with the intent of just seeing someone across the room, like in romance movies or novels, where it's love at first sight. And that's just not really the way that it works. It never has been, and it never will be. And so we're missing this part where you have to actually go out there and talk to people. You actually have to go in there and get to know people and actually learn their personality. All those things are going to make that person either more or less attractive to you. And so it works the same way the other way. If you go out and you meet this guy who is extremely stunningly handsome, and then you start to get to know him, and he's not a great person, he's got a terrible personality, all these things are going to add up to make him less and less attractive to you. So if you're expecting, which a lot of people are these days, you're expecting to see someone and have some sort of, fireworks going off, that's not reality. That's one of those things where you're going to end up misled probably 99% of the time, because you're not doing things properly. You're not going in with the idea that this is a human being and not a picture. And so all these elements are going to add up to making that person either the right one for you or the wrong one for you. And so it's just one of those things where we've gotten so far off of what we're actually supposed to be doing. We're just not interacting with people anymore. And we think that the visual is what everything is going to be based on. And so we're expecting, 6'4", blue eyes, whatever. And not everybody fits that, and it wouldn't make sense for them to. And it wouldn't make sense for me to say that that's the only criteria that is going to make someone perfect for me.
I think that you have everything. Everything you're saying is uh, true and spot on. So I'm very grateful that you are touching upon these very important things, because I'm going to, in congruence with that, what I said before is that back then, before all this, the internet connections, uh, people just went out. I mean, there were mobs of people. I mean, I grew up in Queens, New York, even in some of the more suburban area of Queens. But even if you did go to any neighborhood in Queens in the 80s or 90s, I'm 45 years old now, so I didn't start really going out into the street and doing what I want to throughout all the neighborhoods until, let's say, my early teens. But you can go to any public park there and would see just mobs of young people. Or even if you went to a golf course, for a keg party in the middle of the night. Obviously, that's not legal. You're not supposed to be there, but you can go there and you would see there would be dozens of people there, men and women,
Mhm.
and that's how people met. Actually, it wasn't just the appearance. And if I thinking back, even some of the men who I would call womanizers or poon hounds, none of them were particularly tall or gorgeous. Because to me, again, I don't like to go into the analysis too much, but to me, the status is the most important, actually. Or if you look at men who, let's say, have a girlfriend or wife, it really is the social adjustment. They are socially savvy. I don't think that looks is everything. I don't think it ever was, like you said, actually. It's more status, the ability to accrue resources, and also it is a social cloud as well. So, with that said, I'm going to go over here. Now, what is your opinion of the red pill space? Because to me, the red pill space, okay, it's good that, let me back up for a moment. I want to touch this before I go on, is that you said something about this fantasy with the immediate attraction and the bells and whistles going off and these neurochemicals going wild and hormones boiling, and you're going to see this person, and it's going to be what people online are going by. Peter Wright, Paul Elam, Shah are talking about the romantic model, and how the romantic model will usually fail someone. And I believe the romantic model is actually one of the reasons. There are several reasons for the high divorce rate, but I do believe the romantic model is one of them, because as Paul Elam said, that if it's going to just be, these fireworks going off and chemicals and hormones boiling, that when those feelings go away after the honeymoon phase, then what else is there? I mean, I believe that there should be, let's say, there should be, I think, attraction. When I've discussed arranged marriage, I don't mean a stiffly arranged marriage where, here's a stranger and you have to marry him. And, people, when they think of arranged marriage, that's what they think of. They think of you're going to be paired off with a guy that you can't stand or you're totally not attracted to, and you must marry him and stay with him for life. That's not what I'm talking about. And we'll get to that actually, is that, well, what do you think of that? I mean, there has to be there has to be an attraction, but I think that people these days are not thinking about practicality. I mean, when I think about marriage, I've said before, and I'm going to be, it's a very serious topic here. I don't look at marriage as the union of just two people. It is a sexual union and also an economic union. So there's a practical and the attraction. So when people are looking for mates, I mean, do they really think like, what is this person besides the attractive qualities? What is the practicality here? Could this person educate the children? Does this person know how to have some practical skills around home? What is the job? What is the salary of this woman? Who are her parents? What is this? Where does she come from? Where does he come from? I think that these are all important, and people, I believe, are ignoring that these days. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, and I talked to a number of people. This is actually one of my favorite topics when it comes to relationships, because one of the most probably most beautiful and most well-adjusted and loving couples that I've ever met in my entire life were actually from an arranged marriage.
Yes.
They were Punjabi, and a lot of people, when they think of arranged marriages, they think of just like what you said, where you're stuck with this person, you've been sold off to them, and you just have to live with a lifetime of regret and disappointment. And I don't think that that's realistic at all. In fact, I think that that's something that we're almost missing in this day and age. And this is one of the things that really drew me to Shaw's channel and the idea of the dowry and this return to sort of ancient wisdom when it comes to relationships, because relationships didn't used to be like you said with Paul Elam and Peter Wright. The romantic model is what we're going with now. We meet someone, we get the butterflies, and then we're in it, right? And then we make it work from there. And that's really not the way that it ever worked before. And I think that people misunderstand the importance of having, sorry,
Is
the
everything okay?
importance of having your family involved in your future, your family involved in your relationship, because now we're trying to pick people based on what we feel or what we think. And we're disregarding the whole idea that if someone else was invested, had a vested interest in my well-being and my future, and they could help me make this selection based on other criteria that I'm maybe not thinking about, like my father or my brother or both, you know, I would probably end up in a much more successful relationship because they're not going to get you into a relationship where you're going to be miserable. The whole idea is to find someone who's going to take care of you. Find someone who is going to be able to build a family and build a future with you. And so we're missing that now because we have people just trying to do this on their own, and they're not. There's a lot of things that maybe my father or my brothers might think about that I'm not thinking about. And so I think that we would have ended up in much more successful relationships had we still had these kinds of things in place. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that you brought up, because to me, maybe not arranged marriages, but definitely having family involvement and family support in the relationship or in finding that person for you. I mean, we used to have it to where even not that long ago, it was the typical proposal was to go and ask your father for your
Yes.
hand. And how many people still do that? Not very many. And so, and really, some of the people that I've talked to about these kinds of things, their fathers don't have any interest in their relationships. Once they get to this dating age, I mean, maybe if they're still under 18, the dad has an interest in it. But once you're over 18, typically we're living in an apartment away from our families. Our families don't have any involvement in that. My father's not saying yes or no to a relationship. And if he tried to, I'd probably be very upset about that. So, we've moved away from this whole idea of family interest and parents having a real vested interest in their futures. And it's one of those things that I would really like to see a return to. The reason that the dowry conversation was so attractive to me is not because I think that tomorrow we're going to be able to start implementing a dowry system, but it's an overlooked piece of history more that made things more fair, if you will, made things more of a conversation. What are you bringing to the table? What are they bringing to the table? And it's interesting because that's probably the most heated topic today when it comes to relationships, is what is she bringing to the table? And I know that a lot of times it's kind of approached from this red pill take where it's like, well, what do women bring to the table? Nothing. Um, but it's an interesting conversation because we have gotten into this lifestyle for women where we don't feel like we have to provide any kind of value in a relationship, and we get it in our heads that it's always been that way, to where we never had to provide any kind of value in a relationship, and that's simply not true. That is a really new phenomenon. I mean, even when you think about the 1950s housewife, which I'm not using her as an example because I don't think that that's true traditionalism, and that's another thing that drew me towards this whole gold pill idea. But if we were going to use them as an example, even the 1950s housewife had to provide some sort of value in the household. Her value in the house was making sure that everything that the husband couldn't be home to take care of was being taken care of, making sure that the children didn't have to be raised by a daycare provider, making sure that the household was functioning at peak ability. And so even if you take that into consideration, even the women in the 1950s weren't providing absolutely no value. It was never a situation where you could just exist and be considered valuable. And I think that that's something that especially feminism has pushed onto this younger generation. And they're thinking that because I am a woman, because I can bear children, I should be celebrated as valuable. And I mean, while all people are valuable, I don't think that there's a human being necessarily that doesn't have some sort of value, but it's not just because you exist. And I think that's one of the most interesting things that women are forgetting or just overlooking today, because they think because I exist, I am valuable, and they're using older examples of being valued and being put up on this pedestal as an example of why we're valuable, but they're overlooking the fact that they weren't just valued because of their existence. They were valued because they provided peace to their husband, or they provided a really well functioning household, or they, even before that,
Yes.
they were working to secure the family's future. They were never, if you take, for example, Christian women, this seems to be a really big issue in Christianity, where they want to stay at home and they want all of the benefits of staying at home and not having to work and being taken care of, but they're not necessarily holding up their end of the bargain. And when you think about that, even biblically that's not accurate. One of the most popular examples is the Proverbs 31 woman. She was not sitting at home painting her nails, watching soap operas. She was out in the field doing work. She was, getting dirty, doing the things that needed to be done in order for the family to prosper. And so that's one of those things where we're really missing this whole key element of what we're supposed to be doing, because there's just absolutely never been a time in history where women were simply valued for their existence. And if they were, say, like in goddess worship, or goddess cults, that was not a good thing. We were not being valued for the right things. Men are just as involved when it comes to creating life, and just because we happen to be the ones who incubate life and then sustain that life doesn't mean that men are less valuable in that whole process.
Right, you touched upon a very important things, and that's piqued my interest as you were saying this, because what gets me very frustrated about these red pillars, I call them 2.0 red pillars, because the first red pill was people like, to me, was like Barbarossa, Stardust, Paul Elam, people that were much more serious about this topic, and touching about the root of these problems. And to me, the 2.0 red pillars that are very prominent on the social media, particularly X, is that they do want the woman to just exist. If you look at the posts, these inflammatory posts, they'll say things like, well, I don't know the exact quotes, but they imply that all they want is a woman who is docile, submissive. The quote, "Go make me a sandwich. We don't care about your degrees. We're not." Everything is a turn on to them. We're not aroused by your degrees. We're not interested in your degrees. Everything to them is a titillation. See, there's no practicality with them. So, sometimes I'll actually respond to them. I usually don't get a response, probably because they don't read their responses, or they're not going to like being challenged. I've said to them before, if you're not concerned with this woman's degree in this day and age, you better be concerned with what degree she has. And by the way, I'm not doing this for like virtue signaling. Not every woman has this quote underwater basket weaving degree. If you're a man of, let's say, any status, I'm middle class, or higher status, you should be thinking what this woman did in her academic career. There are women who are surgeons now. Maybe women cannot do things with requiring the upper body strength of a man, but there are professions now where the woman can perform the job as well as a man can. So these are actually serious concerns when you get paired up with someone, especially with the way that the legal system works now also. And you and I both know that women were toiling in the field. Uh, Women didn't know how to fire shotguns, didn't know how to protect themselves to it, maybe not as with the strength of a man, but they have this image of this woman being this dainty woman, again, with the sourdough bread. Everything throughout the tradcon world is sourdough bread. And like we've said, that was not, if we're going to be traditional, that's not tradition. Now, why do you think that when people, because I had this challenge also, is that why do you think when people do bring up, they do mention the family involvement? For example, in the online spaces that I've, let's say, contributed to with my posts, if I say, no, there should be male approval of suitors. Well, we can't even call them suitors now. They call them pickup artists, seducers, whatever the hell people call now. You're dating this guy. Why do you think that they oppose this? Do you think that they oppose this because they don't want to look bad by saying, no, I have authority with him, who speaks to my wife and who speaks to my teenage daughter? Do they not want to seem domineering? Have feminists put such fear in them that they don't want to seem like they're, they don't want to be looked upon in a bad way? Or is it that they don't want the fun to end? Because we all know that if we did have this male authority, this sleeping around and casual sex is going to end. Do you think that it's really because a lot of the men want the fun to keep up? Because if, there was a time, and I've said this before, and this is actually truth, where we call them Chads and Tyrones now. And I'm going to say this whether people like it or not. Back in the day, Chad and Tyrone were not worshipped in the way that they are now. Men were not wishing, can I be Chad or Tyrone? I'd love to be Chad or Tyrone. I would have all these women. Back then, they were called Cads, and serious penalties were paid to them, including lynching, including their employment removed, including legal sanctions. So do you think that they just don't want the fun to end? Because even though they should be thinking of the protection of their daughter, they know that their fun's going to end if we have, let's say, a more normal society? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it definitely has an element of that. I think that there are definitely certain men who that's the very reason that they don't want to be given back that authority. And I think that for a lot of men, they just because of the way that feminism kind of took control, the reason that a lot of people don't think about feminism pre 1960 is because that's when it really became inundated in society. That's when they really kind of took control of a lot of social projects and a lot of our mindset when it comes to being a society. And I think that women have raised children, both boys and girls, to think that they don't want men to be too overbearing when it comes to women. And so you have these generations of, and I'm sure, you and I are part of these generations where our mothers raised us in a certain way to where they didn't want men to be insensitive. And so because of that, they kind of taught their sons. And of course, we also have that's when we start to see a lot of rise in divorce, a lot of rise in single motherhood. And so all these things kind of contribute to men not thinking that authority is necessarily a good thing. And so, when you discriminate against, authority figures in that way, like you don't want men to be too overbearing, you don't want men to be controlling, you don't want men to be insensitive. And so when you start raising your boys in that way, there's going to be a certain distaste for having authority over females, and the same thing with women, where you're not going it's one of those reasons why women react so viscerally when we're kind of told what to do or what have you by our significant other, because we've been raised to think that that is a way of controlling us. And so I think that it's kind of a combination issue, but definitely I think that there are the pickup artists and whatnot that see that as being a bad thing. If we do encourage this male involvement in decision making when it comes to relationships, we're not going to get away with the same things that we got before. Whereas back in like the 1950s, you always saw the dad with the shotgun on the, they're waiting for her to get home from her date because he wanted to ensure, what are your intentions with my daughter? And you just don't see a lot of that anymore. And I think that it's just a combination issue where feminists have said, we don't need that protection. We don't need you to control us. And then, of course, you have men who are supportive of that because they don't want to have that sort of that blockade to having fun and having women who are willing to do these things and not being, I don't want to say repressed, but that's kind of the common buzzword that feminists use for it, being sexually repressed or what have you. And while there is an element of understanding with that, at the same time, it's really just kind of a benefit for people who don't want to be shamed and don't want to have any kind of rules. So
Exactly. That's really what it is. I think you have it spot on. I think I have it spot on as well. It's a combination. However, what I don't like about this also is that people, I was discussing this with Annie Nowicki in my first video that I put out about these problems, is that people do not, he said that people think about sex in a disembodied way. They just think of the act, actually. The reason why we had sexual regulation is because we don't want to clean up after other people's messes. See, it's not just the act, though. And I believe that people don't think of things beyond the act because they don't believe that, not believe, we've been, it's been drilled into us so much that sex is only for pleasure and thrills and fun, which it is actually. We do like sex, but we never want to think of the aspect that this is where babies come from, and this is why it's so serious. And also, my belief, and I will not give any details here. I think that you know what I'm alluding to, and it's a very serious. They were very serious issues. That if you do open up the floodgates to where any man can talk to our daughters, that a degree of abuse, actual abuse, not the feminist view, term of abuse, real abuse of very young females, I'm not going to call them women, get into very dangerous
mhm.
and even criminal situations. So my view is that as a man, I really don't care if a red pillar says anything mean about me. I really don't give a crap, actually. But they never think of what can happen. They don't go to that level of if you get deviant men around your family members, that something very bad can happen. And I also know of cases in which these things did happen. So, what do you think of that? Do you think that they are incapable of seeing beyond this? That you're just going to end the fun when they're not thinking about what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where they don't want to see what's out there. They don't want to see the forest. They'd rather just kind of see the trees that are right in front of them. And again, this is another thing where if we had more family involvement, if we had more of those older sort of moral ramifications where you were going to be shamed if you behaved in this certain way, or you were going to be stigmatized if you behaved in this certain way, I think that we would have a lot less of this type of
Yes,
behavior. And it's one of those things where if you do see women being abused and exploited because
yes,
there are not these safety nets in place where they used to have them. If my father and my brother were heavily involved in my success in my relationship and my husband started abusing me, or he became a drunkard,
yeah,
or, all these things, he's going to first be shamed, and then he's going to be beat up, or he's going to be
yeah,
taken out of town. So it's one of those things where if we really think about these things logically, if I were being abused by my husband, the whole town would know about it, and he
yes,
was not going to get away with it. But yet, it's one of those things that feminists like to say as if it were the truth, but yet there's not any evidence of it. And it's funny to me because we see how women used to write diaries, they wrote letters home, they were even writing books, even though feminists love to say that we weren't able to read and write. That's absolutely untrue. And so, is all the evidence that women were being abused? They would have put those types of things in their diaries. They would have put those types of things in letters home to their families. And there just simply isn't any of that. And if there was, feminists would love to see it because they would be highlighting it every single day. It just simply doesn't exist. But because there's no evidence of the contrary, they can say whatever they want. And one of my favorite things to bring up, not that it's a positive thing, but it's interesting because feminists love to say that women were treated like property, women were treated like less than human, but yet the Titanic is a great example of the fact that women have been being pedestalized for much longer than what feminists try to act like. And men, it didn't matter what your status was. One of the richest men in the world was on the Titanic and drowned. Boys as young as 9 and 10 were not let onto lifeboats because they were men. And it was women and children only. And so the fact that only 17% of men survived that tragedy, and I'm sure some of them would have probably been shamed for getting onto those lifeboats if they did. That just proves to me that that's really just a bunch of garbage. There really is no truth to that fact, because clearly women were seen as very, very important if they were the ones who were getting onto those lifeboats, because you didn't even have to have children in order to get on the lifeboats. If you were a woman of any age, you could get on the lifeboats. And there was like I want to say over 75% of women survived that tragedy. And the majority of the ones who didn't were in the lower classes. And so that to me proves that women were clearly always considered valuable as far as being mothers and being, life givers, but men have always been considered disposable. And so it's one of those things that a lot of feminists don't like to bring up because they can't explain what the reason is. If we were so oppressed and we were treated as less than human and we were valued as simply property, why didn't we go down with the ship? I'm sure that if I had if I had to choose and a ship was going down with Elon Musk or Megan Fox on board, I'm probably not gonna choose Megan Fox. So it's one of those things where just because you were a man, you had to drown. And so that's very telling to me. And I think that it's one of those things that we really need to consider more of, because there is historical evidence that feminists are not telling us the truth,
right.
but we don't think about things in the big picture. We think about things in the immediate now. We think about things in whatever context we've been given. And so if feminists say that this certain thing was happening, I'm not going to put myself back in that situation and think, was that really what was happening? I'm just going to take what they say for the truth, because there's really no evidence that it wasn't happening in that way. I'm sorry, I don't know if I got off topic there, but I
It's
just
fine
started
because
rambling.
no, I really do appreciate it. I mean, I'm expressing that I'm really very grateful that you're telling what you're telling me, actually, and telling my audience actually what they will be hearing when I publish this. These are very important things. And now another thing, that being that you're continuing with feminism, is that you see, like we said before, with the element of women wanting dangerous men for probably evolutionary reasons that we're not going to remove, whether it's, let's say, a criminal or even just men who are of high status or men that are very assertive and also socially adjusted. Perhaps let's just use the word popular because that could be attractive as well. Because, that probably, look, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but being popular probably does give someone a hint that this guy has his life together or has resources or has something that people want or like or respect.
Mhm.
Now, being that we're talking about feminism, is that now the feminists want equality, but at the same time, like they want those strong men, they also want men who are higher status, but women have already acquired higher status. Now, you would think to yourself, if women want equality, well, feminists want equality, right? Wouldn't they pair up with a man who was earning the same as them? But no, what these women want, like most women want, and I do not blame women for wanting this because I don't really think there's something inherently wrong with hypergamy in itself. Just the way that I don't think it's wrong for men to be attracted to pretty faces and curves. It's the same kind of thing. You're not going to get us out of this, right? So, and that's what we leverage our attraction with. The man uses his status, and the woman, they pay attention to their looks and other things, like we're saying. Also, well, traditionally speaking, other things besides looks, but it seems to be the looks went. We're going out of control with the look, as you said. So, what are men going to do now if we have this equality in the workplace, but we cannot expect all these men to raise their status over here to get mates? This is going to be impossible. But you see, they want the equality. They talk about the equality, but then when it comes to their personal life, they want a man who provides even more than they do. Is this another contradiction? Well, it is actually.
I absolutely think it is a contradiction. It's funny. I look at these things and I'm always like, how did this come about? Because they say equality and women just kind of go with that. And it's funny because any feminist or anyone who subscribes to feminist ideology that you ask, or that you even try to have a conversation with, they always revert to it's just about equality. It's about equality. But yet the behavior that most feminists have is domination. And so you have this sort of thing that just doesn't make much sense, where they say that they want equality, but they're always trying to get more, and they're always trying to get more, and they want power. They basically just, to me, they want power. And I think that a lot of it comes from this idea that women are more suited to society, if you will. Women have always been the ones that conform better, the ones that don't, speak necessarily, the way that other people are offended or that other people are upset by. You'll change the way that you're behaving or the way that you're speaking to fit what other people are going to be upset by. And that's very much a female trait, and it's one of the reasons why you see in school girls being very well fit to the environment of school, where they can sit still, they can be quiet, they can take turns, they can be patient. And you see a lot of boys getting disciplinary action, day after day, because they don't sit still well. They want to go run and jump, and they don't really, especially at the younger ages, don't understand why they can't go climb that tree and, do the things that they want to do. And they're not really paying attention, and they're not necessarily considerate of the other people's feelings or whose turn it is. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. And it's not very conducive to a learning environment, but it's not a bad thing in the real world. You have women or girls who are naturally conformists. They're going to be also easier to take advantage of. They're also going to be more corruptible. And so it makes sense that our natural counterpart would maybe be someone who would push back against some sort of authority figure that may not have our best interests at heart. And so it's one of those things where we get these things really, we find them very offensive, that men will kind of say what they think or what they mean, and we will lie to other people to appease them or to protect their feelings. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but we get it in our heads at a very young age that women are more respectful, women are more, or females are more patient, we're more understanding, we're more responsible, and men are, or boys are, more out of control. They're less trustworthy. They're the ones you kind of have to keep your eye on. And so we get these things in our head at a really, really young age, and it continues to be pushed year after year after year, where okay, well, that's because men are irresponsible. That's because men are childish, that's because men. And so those things are really solidified in our minds that we're just better at being in society. We're better at running things. We're better at doing what's best for the whole, everybody. And that's really not the truth at all. It's just this false idea that we're given over years and years of being in an unnatural environment like school or workplace. And we get these things in our head that are completely false. It's not really a good thing to lie to somebody else just to make them feel better. It's not really a good thing to conform without asking questions, and those are things that women are just kind of naturally, they're just naturally inclined to do, whereas men are naturally inclined to be like, no, why would I do that? I'm not going to do that. No, are you crazy? You should definitely lose weight because you're going to die at a young age. These are the things that men are willing to say to people, they're willing to do, and women get it in their heads that that's a bad thing. And so we want to make sure that or feminists want to make sure that we're always the ones in charge, that we're the ones who have the most power, because if we let men have more power than us, or more provision, then they're going to take advantage of that, and we're going to be back in the kitchens and back in the slave role, if you will. And they just get these really false notions in their head that make them react in certain ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why women are constantly trying to get more. They're saying equality because that's what everyone wants to hear. I always say this, that feminists say equality because it sounds a lot better than world domination. Because people wouldn't probably look quite as kindly on that as they do on equality. Equality sounds nice, it sounds lovely, but that's really not what they're after. If they were, we wouldn't have feminists continuing to push these things. We wouldn't have feminists who are already at the highest income bracket trying to find a higher value man than them. You wouldn't have feminists in positions of power who are trying to make things impossible for men or for women that they disagree with. I'm a woman, but the feminists don't like me. And so in the feminist utopia, there would be no men, and women like me would be doing slave labor. And so that's one of the reasons why I started to speak out, is not just for the relationship aspect of it all, but also for just the falsehood that is feminism. They say equality, they say women's rights, we should all be in this wonderful sisterhood together. And I know from communicating with feminists that there is nothing beautiful about that sisterhood, that they will turn on you in an instant if you don't go along with the status quo. If you don't go along with what they're saying and what they want to push, then you have become the enemy, and you clearly have internalized misogyny, and you should probably, just stop talking. So
Yes, I'm again. I'm going to repeat myself. I'm very glad that you're revealing all these things. Very important information, actually, and that leads me to two other things. Actually, it's going to lead me, because you didn't mention the education topic here. Is that, do you think that we should have perhaps sex segregated schooling again? Because I actually do believe there is some benefit to having the sexes separated, because of exactly what you spoke about. I do think that and also I believe that it creates, considering the environment that I grew up in, let's say we call it the latchkey era of the early 90s, where these kind of restrictions on what people do, and there's no supervision, like we're talking about, no family involvement of who goes with who, kind of like this unbridled free for all, where much of even the classroom setting, or let's say even the lunch break or other recreational time, becomes this display, becomes this obsession with the men trying to get the women, and everybody competing against each other, and the men becoming obsessed with the women. Now that's what I experienced when I was going to school, actually. But considering that we have different learning styles and different uh, cognitive dispositions, I mean, would it be beneficial if we just did it an old-fashioned way, where we segregated the sexes in education? And also, what I've noticed, and I want to throw this in there though, is that we've become so obsessed with sexual politics. And I have the book by Stephen Baskerville here, actually called The New Politics of Sex, with a very, very revealing book. Is that we've become so obsessed with this that even that the mention of a man being a teacher to young men, they immediately start making you know what kind of accusations they start making. So even men who want to be benevolent and to raise the next generation of men, they get called all kinds of names that I don't even want to say here because I'm gonna be on YouTube. I mean, this is very unfair that to think that just because a man wants to uh, educate and transmit culture to a new generation of boys, that he has to be called such a slanderous term. Sometimes it's just an assumption or even a false accusation of that. This obsession with sexual relations does not even allow us to finally move on. And as we've seen in especially on X these posts, that is not only men who are of offenders that I don't even want to think about. There are many women who are teaching children who are guilty of the same, actually in some cases flat out guilty, not just an accusation or allegation. So that's a moot point because it's not only one sex who does these kind of serious transgressions. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that as far as educating boys and girls separately, I think that that would be a phenomenal idea. I've read a lot of different research that shows that when boys and girls are educated separately, that they do have much better outcomes. And so it's one of those things where, too, I think that part of the problem, and I don't want to just kind of demean women all of the time because I am a woman and I think that women are great. I
Right.
think that we just have gotten to this point where we're all a bunch of, you know, programmed fembots that think one way because that's how we've been kind of taught to think. And it's interesting to me because we see as soon as kids start going to school, we see this kind of conforming attitude, not just for boys, but also for girls, because you don't see any kind of encouragement for women being mothers. You don't see
That's
any kind of encouragement for women being homemakers. You know, you used to have classes like home ec and parenting and things like that used to be a standard part of school for the girls, maybe even for the boys, but you don't see that anymore. The youth shop used to be a very typical part of a school for boys, and you don't see that anymore. We've gotten to this point where school has become this sort of melting pot where everything is on like an even playing field, but we're dealing with two very different sides of the human species. And so they do learn differently, they do behave differently, they do have different inclinations, they do have typically different desires as far as what they're going to want to do when they grow up. And something that I've found extremely interesting is that when I taught preschool for many, many years, you know, you'll do projects or whatever. And when I would ask kids what they want to be when they grow up, boys are always fireman, police officer, you know, some kind of helpful career. And women or girls, I'm sorry, are always, almost always, they want to be mommy. They want to be a mommy. And so, but then you're kind of like, well, okay, but what else do you want to be? Because that's not a career. That's not something that you can put down as what you want to be when you grow up. I would always put that, but you know that in the future, that you know that's not going to be encouraged. And it's funny to me because we always see where it's like, okay, now you need to pick your career, and women aren't necessarily naturally inclined towards career if they're going to have children. Yes, they're going to do some sort of work, they're going to do some sort of supportive role as far as the household goes, but I'm a firm believer that once you do have children, your children shouldn't be being raised by somebody else. And that's the problem that we get into a lot of times with the way that we teach children nowadays. We teach them that they're going to go to college, they're going to get a career, and we really don't focus any on what type of family or what type
yeah.
of you know, legacy they're going to build for their family. And whereas I'm all about women working, you know, I worked myself and I understand the need for income, especially in this economy. But at the same time, we see that girls really do desire, they really do have that internal you know, want to be a nurturing, you know, mothering type of figure. And so we're crushing that very early on in these kids. We're saying, oh, but you can't do that. Well, yeah, I know, mommy, but what do you want to, what job do you want to have, you know? And so we're kind of programming them in this way to make them feel like, you know, they are the same, you know, boys and girls are the same, we are we have the same capabilities and we have the same life goals and whatnot. And I think that that really muddies uh the whole outlook of their future. And so I think that if we had schools where boys and girls were taught differently from their learning styles and from what they actually were going to be trying to achieve in life, I think that we would have much better outcomes as far as the learning goes, because you're putting boys and girls into these environments where they're expected to perform the same and given the same style of teaching. And this is why we see boys really falling behind as far as school goes, because their inclinations just simply aren't designed for four walls and a chalkboard, whereas girls, that's actually pretty conducive for us, because we like sitting and playing tea party and mommy and things like that. We like being teacher and doing those sorts of things, whereas boys are really not getting much out of that situation. And so I absolutely think that boys and girls should be educated separately, maybe even together, but have a lot of separate programs, a lot of separate
Yes.
classes, and maybe could come together for certain other things. But this, it really does just encourage this idea that boys and girls are the same, and we really just are not. We absolutely are not. We have very different inclinations from the very beginning, and trying to say that we are the same is a very, very unfair tactic, and it's really not helping anyone, honestly. And I'm so sorry, I don't remember
That's
what the
fine.
second part of your question was.
No, no, you are answering. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna flow with something else. Actually, if you're done, if you're done, I'll say something. But if you're not done, you can go on. I'm not going to interrupt you. Yeah.
No, you're fine. I just was, there was another part of what you were saying there that I was going to hit on. And I don't think that I did, but that's okay.
No, you did actually. And what
Okay.
I want to say, and I'll segue into another question. And I'm going longer than intended, but you're saying so many important things here. I do have time. Do you have a little more time?
Yeah, yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, so now that we're talking about education, I don't want to get myself too thrown off here. And one thing I want to go over that I do not want to forget is that as far as the sexual education going in school, what I remember from the 90s of sexual education was simply, I think it was only two things. No one get pregnant and use a condom or birth control. I mean, nothing else was mentioned. Nothing about marriage, nothing. I mean, there was some education about, let's say, menstrual cycles and what goes on with the body, but nothing into the future. It was just simply don't get pregnant, be careful. Don't get pregnant, be careful. That's all there is. Or don't catch an STD, so to speak. But all these
Mhm.
other practical things here. What is a marriage like? What are the sexual dynamics? I mean, maybe some things that we're discussing here are a little too over the head of, let's say, a young, I don't know, teenager. But I would like to tell my son when he's 18, maybe even earlier, maybe 16, this is the deal here. Everything in that in the videos that I maybe that I'm archiving here on YouTube when he's grown up, I'm saying that you should know this stuff, even if some of it, let's
Mhm.
say, excuse me, maybe it could be a little bit of a vulgar nature sometimes. People need to be aware of these things. People need to be aware of who they're dealing with, the nature of one another, even, let's say, even the less desirable impulses that we have, to really find a mate and make a nice life for yourself with a partner that suits you. So I think the sexual education is abominable. But we homeschool. We're part of a homeschooling co-op, so we'll be able to fashion things in the way that we want to when it comes to this sort of health and sexual education. Actually, aside from the other subjects, now also in schools, and I think that I have to look into this a little farther. Actually, it's a topic that I want to get into. There are so many facets of what's going on now, which makes it so ridiculous, so to speak, and maladaptive. Is that, do you think that, or do you know if men are being flat out discriminated against in schooling? Meaning that I understand that on college campuses, from the work of Dr. Helen Smith, who I interviewed last Sunday, that some of these campuses are hostile to men, meaning that in the non-scientific subject areas, there is a misandric theme running through the campuses. Is there actual discrimination, or let's say if not actual discriminations, are there more programs that suit women to get ahead and let's say exhort them to go into certain fields and make it a little, well, you have to have the talent to go into certain fields, but I think you know where I'm going with. It's more like some advantages or programs or recruitment or exhortation that men are not getting.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think so. And one of the most eye-opening things, this actually came to my attention long before I was ever a teacher. And I had noticed over the years, again, I was just a really analytical child. I kind of paid attention to things in the way that teachers behaved and whatnot. And one of the things that made me want to become a teacher was noticing how teachers treated boys. And so I don't want to say that they were purposely mean to them, and I don't even know if they really understood that they were doing it. But you would see where teachers would often be very hard on the boys for absolutely no reason. And I thought to myself that they just didn't understand the inclinations of boys, that they just didn't understand the way that boys learn or the way that the environment affected boys. And so when I got to college, I realized that they do actually understand all those things. They know these things very, very well. They understand that there are very different learning styles. They understand that boys have very different inclinations to girls. They understand all of these things very well, but they they don't implement anything differently. They in early childhood they try to a little bit in like the preschool ages, but from very, very early kindergarten on, the expectation is set to where it doesn't matter what your learning style is. It doesn't really matter if this is going to put you if this is going to put you behind the girls and the girls ahead of the boys. It's just what's right for the learning environment. So they very much tailor things to where the environment is the focus rather than the way that the students teach. And I don't know if that's done on purpose or done just because this is the way we know how to teach and this is just what we're going to continue to do. But they are aware of the fact that there are better learning styles for boys, that there are better learning environments for boys, but they don't implement any of those because it would mean that they would have to separate boys and girls in teaching. They would have to separate them. And I think that because the teaching industry is majority female, and I will tell you from personal experience, it is very much radical feminists that teach and who are running administrations for education. It is very much why we have a lot of woke ideology in schools today, because from the top to the bottom, it is really inundated with radical feminism. And part of the problem is that teachers like me who don't subscribe to that sort of mindset and who don't agree with those things, we get nowhere, because you can try all that you want to say, hey, maybe we should look at these things, maybe we should change some of the things that we're doing, and you're not going to get a bit of assistance from anyone as far as implementing those things. And so you're going to just have to continue doing as you're doing. And I think that part of it is because they don't want to admit that boys and girls are different. They don't want to admit that girls do have a behavior style and inclinations that are more conducive to the learning environment that we've set up, and boys don't. They would rather just see girls getting ahead and boys falling behind and say, well, it's because, boys don't know how to behave and boys don't know how to sit still, rather than saying that we know that already and we know why, and we do have ways that we could teach them better. So, and as far as what you were saying earlier, I'm sorry, I remembered what you had said. You were talking about male teachers having kind of a stigma about them when they do try to go in and teach and become educators. And we're seeing a lot of, there's just no male teachers anymore. And I think part of it is, again, because radical feminism is kind of the name of the game, and if you're not on board with that, then you're not going to get very far. But it's also, we like to, like you were saying, they put this label on men. Oh, well, you must be you must like young girls or something. That's why you're in it. But what we've seen throughout tons of examples of not even just history but modern history, where when women are put in a position of power, uh, they tend to prey on those who are weaker than them much more often than men do. And that's one of the reasons why patriarchal societies tend to work better than matriarchal societies, because patriarchal societies, men tend to be more benevolent. Men tend to be more about keeping the tribe alive versus the single person alive. And females don't tend to be that way. We are kind of wired for manipulation and self-preservation versus preservation of the entire tribe. And so I think that's why you see a lot more mothers are abusive to their children. Even though they'll show you those statistics that say, oh, but this percentage of children are abused by males. A lot of the times that those are, mom's boyfriend or mom's, live-in partner, and mom is also involved in that abuse, or at least, aware of that abuse. And so you see in single mother homes versus single father homes that outcomes are tragic. There's much more abuse, there's much more neglect, there's much more of the mother focusing on herself and her own life versus, what's best for her children. And that's why you see them in these kinds of situations. Whereas men tend to think differently. If men have children and they are the sole custodial parent, they'll change their entire lifestyle to fit what works for them and their kid. They'll not put up with a woman who doesn't treat their child right because they understand. And I think that part of it isn't just malice. Part of it is that women don't like to, they don't want to upset people that they care about. They don't want to upset their children. They don't want their children to, be sad or whatever. And especially single mothers, they tend to feel guilty. And so they'll kind of let things slide that they maybe shouldn't because they feel bad that they're the only one and that they're not able to give them the attention that they would like to because they have to work or what have you. And so they'll let certain things go, even though they know they shouldn't. Whereas fathers are much more likely to say, nope, we're not going to do that. That's not what we do. And so they're much less likely to kind of give into those sorts of things. And so I think that a lot of what ends up being, what seems malicious by women is really just that they don't want other people not to like them. They don't want their kids not to think that they're great or, what have you. And I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just my personal experience with single mothers, but the statistics are out there that single mother households definitely have less less positive outcomes, and single father outcomes tend to be right in line with dual parent households. So
Well, I'm very glad that you're revealing that as well, because that is actually one of my favorite authors in this subject area is Dr. Daniel Lemnius, who's the author of the Case for Father Custody and the Garbage Generation, which I've been recommending in all of my videos, which I think that people should read if they want to delve into these crises that we are discussing here. And he also he is very repetitive in his books, but he really does nail this home of all the phenomena that you just discussed, actually. And actually, that goes well with what I'm about to actually talk about here. It's good that you're saying all this because it seems to flow very well into the next topics, the successive topics we'll be addressing. I appreciate that. So, this actually goes into the topic of sexual freedom, meaning that it goes into the so-called, what we vulgarly and the crude talk now of so-called body count. Now, to me, the sexual freedom is what causes this kind of chaos, actually. The sexual freedom and the willingness to leave husbands, to leave partners, this goes in line with the sexual freedom. Because people will say things like, for example, when they talk about this body count issue, they look at it in very childish terms, I believe, especially the red pillars, the so-called seducers online, the PUAs, whatever we want to call them. They look at this in very again, very infantile terms, or either it goes either way. They'll say never to have women that have a so-called high body count. I don't even like that term, by the way. It's very crude and nasty. Or you have others who actually shame men who do not want a woman with a high body count. But you see, my view is this: the men who shame the men who are concerned about the body count are not the men who want to marry a woman and have children with them. If you are a man who wants a family, a wife, and children, you should be concerned about the track record of what a woman is like, because you can also be stuck, especially in this day and age with the courts, the way that the courts work now. Also, I mean, they'll say that body count doesn't matter. Well, like Paulina said, well, if the body count doesn't matter, why is there 421 million bucks? No, 421 billion bucks spent from the federal budget on single mothers and their offspring. I thought body count doesn't matter. And again, you can see this is from thinking about sex in a disembodied way. To them, to the these tough guys online, it's just a number. They might be disgusted by the number, or they might not think that the number is anything big, but it's just a number. They never think about what is the outcome of it. The sexual freedom lends to the single mother household. That's what happens when there's no regulation. So, and then also the rest of society has to clean up this mess. And like we said, when there's no male authority, well, the reason why the men had the shotguns is because they didn't want their grandchildren to have no fathers and for them to clean up the mess. Now, if it happened to me, I don't think it will happen, but you never know. Of course, I would raise this grandchild of mine, but this is not what we want. We want high investment parenting. The high investment parenting does not come when people are running amok with freedom. Um, and if you look at it, because I'm from New York City, again, I'm from tree-lined Little Neck. It's a nice suburban area, but there were social pathologies that were in those neighborhoods. Either they were so-called middle class, in which people were practicing the sexual freedom already, and also the divorce regime was already in effect in the early 90s. But I've also worked in Bushwick, I worked in Jamaica, I worked in all the neighborhoods that our favorite rappers mention in their songs. Like, you know, the Run DMC song, The Avenue? My dad owned a store on the Avenue. Two of my jobs were on the Avenue, Jamaica Avenue, actually, right? So if you go to these lower income areas that are filled with public housing, you will see sexually free mothers and all their fatherless offspring. Where are the fathers? Nowhere around. But I thought that body count doesn't matter though. And what about the children have to endure a life without fathers? And we know that the fatherless problem, which is a quarter of households now, lends to, and I do not believe that there's a link anymore. It's not a link or correlated. It causes all these social pathologies from gang membership, teenage pregnancy, criminality, prison sentences, suicide, lack of academic achievement, lack of financial achievement. We can just keep going down the list. Most neurotics, most people in juvenile detention centers, most juveniles in psychiatric centers. We just keep going and going and going. But I thought body count doesn't matter though. And we have the birth control pill, but this problem keeps getting worse. I thought if everybody just takes pills and everybody just gets abortions, these problems would just go away. So, in the essay by Roger Devlin called Rotating Polyandry and Its Enforcers, you can see what happens to a man who's not paying attention to this matter, the body count matter. These people think it's a goddamn joke. Now, I'm sorry for getting heated here, though, but that really rubs me the wrong way. I'm going to calm down now, and you could go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think that it's one of those things where we just don't think about things in the bigger picture. We think about them in the immediate, what I want to do and what feels good to me. And, you know, this kind of stuff really did start in the sexual revolution. Again, that's probably why a lot of people have bad feelings towards the feminist wave that started in the 60s, because that is really when they pushed really hard for women to be sexually open and sexually free, and it has led to very disastrous results. And it's one of those things where if you don't know what you're looking at, you could say, well, that has nothing to do with it. You know, that's just means that women aren't repressed anymore. And if you think that women with a high body count, if there's something wrong with that, then you're just an insecure guy, and you're just worried that she's going to remember somebody else that she liked better in bed or whatever, which
Yeah.
is ridiculous. You know, it's one of those things. It's ridiculous because
Yeah.
first of all, I mean, I'm not a virgin, obviously, but I can tell you that when you're with someone that you don't really care about that much, it's much different than when you're with someone that you truly do
Yes.
care about. You know, it's a much different experience. And to say that it's not, to say that sex is just sex is absolutely ridiculous. And so, you know, you have people who are out there thinking that, well, if it doesn't work out with this guy, or if he puts any kind of limitations on me, he must just be a controlling, insecure psychopath, and I'll just leave him for somebody else. And so, again, we also have no fault divorce, which I feel like is completely disastrous. I think that that's a cop out. It's an easy way out of a relationship that's not supposed to be easy. You know, relationships are not supposed to be you know, walk in the park. They're supposed to be work. They're supposed to be you know, actual effort involved with that. And so if you're going into a relationship thinking, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll just go on to the next guy, it's going to be a disastrous situation. And the fatherless epidemic is horrible. I honestly think it's probably one of the worst things that we have happening in society today, because all the reasons you just said, we have the data, we have the statistics that prove that when kids don't have fathers, both male and female,
Yes.
they have disastrous outcomes. You know, they are much more likely to be incarcerated. They're much more likely to have mental illness. They're much more likely to end up homeless. They're much more likely to run away. They're much more likely to have bad grades. They're much more likely to get involved with drugs. And so all of these things really compound to make a huge issue that we're acting like is not really that big of a deal. And again, it's because people don't want to feel that shame. They don't want to feel like they're doing something wrong, and so they reach for whatever the easiest excuse is, and they grab hold of it and say, well, it's because, you know, it's because men are controlling, and they shouldn't be like that, and I'm not, they're not my father, or what have you. And any excuse that you can have to get out of that situation, and now you don't even have to prove that there's anything. You don't have to say there was no abuse, there was no. And we see this a lot. Women are over 75% of divorces are initiated by women. And when they give reason for that, the reasons are not because he cheated on me. They're not because he abused me. They're because he wasn't making me happy, or because it just wasn't what I wanted. And, we have this very selfish outlook on things where it's like, if I'm not getting everything that I want, then there must be something wrong with this situation. And we don't take into consideration that there is a whole other person involved in this situation. And then, of course, if you have children, there's more than just that other person involved in this situation. But nobody wants to consider what the outcome is for the children. And I think that's probably the biggest tragedy that I see in relationships today is we're so willing to have children with someone, but we're not willing to stick it out and try to make it work. And it's funny because, sorry, I say it's funny. I was not really funny, but it's interesting because you will see people saying, "Well, he was a terrible person. He was controlling." Sorry,
Sorry.
he was controlling. He was, an abuser. But I went ahead and had kids with him, and then I had a couple more kids with him. And it's like, well, if he was that horrible of a person, then why did you continue having kids with him? And women will come up with all sorts of excuses to say, well, I didn't have a choice. I couldn't get birth control, or I couldn't, whatever. But the truth of the matter is they just weren't willing to do the work. They weren't willing to see their own issues, their own problems, and their things that they were bringing to the situation that were negative, and contributing to the overall issue. And it's much easier, rather than dealing with your own issues, to just blame it on someone else and file for divorce and say, well, I can do it better on my own. And a lot of times women are expecting things out of men that they really shouldn't be. I don't know if you saw that video with the girl. She's like, the reason I almost divorced my husband, and it was because of she wanted him to load the dishwasher or
Yes.
something in the morning and make sure that and I'm like, that's a really trivial issue. And not only that, but I'm pretty sure she worked from home, and she's like, I was late too. He was going to make me late, and he was going to be late. That's why he didn't do it, but he was making me late. And that's how little he considered me. And, women will take things like that very, very personally, when in all actuality, he just wasn't thinking about that. He wasn't considering it. He was running late, and he just didn't have time to do it. And so he's not going to do it. But women will take things like that as a very personal slight on them, and their honor, and, how valuable they are to their significant other. And, I can kind of speak to this from experience because, like I said, I've never been a feminist, but there are definitely times when I have been kind of being ridiculous about something. And in the moment, I'm thinking, no, this is ridiculous. He's being totally out of, just out of line, and he has no right to say things like this to me. And then later on, I'll think about it, and it's like, yeah, but really, was I honestly being very fair in the situation? It's like we have this root cellar outside, and it's older than the house is, and I really like it for whatever reason. We've lived in this house for 14 years though, and I've never stepped foot in this root cellar. And so his cousin was on his way. He's like, he's near here, and he's got the excavator. Can he come, tear out the cellar? And I was like, no, I don't want him to. And he's like, yeah, but you've never even been down there the whole time we've been in this house. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but I really like it. And he's like, okay. So he's like, is there a reason why we should keep it? And I'm just like, I was kind of irritated, but at the same time, I was like, no, there's not a reason why we should keep it. It's stupid. It's nothing to me, really. But it's just one of those things where women will get something in our head that's like, that's important to me. And if he says something against it, then he must not care what's important to me. Whereas men are typically thinking like, okay, we've lived here for 14 years. She's never stepped foot in there. It's in my way when I try to mow and things like that. And they're coming from a real practical sort of way. And they're not thinking about, I'm going to totally crush her spirit if I do this when she doesn't want me to. They're thinking practically, we need it gone. It's in the way, and she's never been down there. And so I could have easily, felt myself being like, I'm going to throw a huge fit about this, but what purpose would that have served? It would have just been ridiculous. And he's right. I've never been down there. I don't really care about it, or I would have gone down there and done something with it by now in 14 years.
Yes.
But that's just kind of one of those things where naturally women, we get in our heads that if something's important to us, it should be important to him too, even if it makes absolutely no sense. And that's one of those things where I wish most women could kind of take a step back from things like that and see from a different perspective why that's absolutely ridiculous, but a lot of them don't. And so they think these things are really personal to them. And they think that speaks to the fact that their husband is abusive and controlling and doesn't really care about their feelings. So,
Yes. Thank you again. I'm going to say it again. Thank you for all this that you're revealing here. And it was what you're saying is very useful and revealing. And also, what I got in my head also is that we were discussing the body count issue. Also, is that one thing that everything that you said was important is very important. However, one thing that I think is very infantile, because I'm going to go delve a little more into the red pill grifter type of thing, and then we're going to come up with the final topic I want to discuss, and then we'll close it out. I want to come up with perhaps some talk of solutions, perhaps, which is not going to be an easy topic to discuss because I believe that many people are uh, scared of some solutions, so to speak. Now, what I think is extremely infantile is that when the red pill grifters or whatever these PUAs or seducers or whatever or other people in line, again, they're only thinking about the act again, meaning that I didn't get a chance to comment. I mean, not that you were just explaining things yourself. I didn't want to interrupt you. Is that they'll say things like, the reason why you're obsessed with the body count is because you can't measure up to the previous guy. What do you have, a blah, blah, blah? You know what I'm saying? Or you can't compete with the other guy. Meanwhile, what you and I said from a civilizational or societal or social aspect to it, meaning families ripped apart from home wreckers or single mother households being created. Those are far more important than some guy being worried about someone who's competing with. I mean, I'm going to admit to you here, I did not always have my view on the life the way that I have now. And I'm going to admit that, like you said, that, you're not a virgin, we're not virgins, we do have families, we have children, but I'm going to admit that I've had casual sex in my life. And I never ever thought of that. It never occurred to me, well, this woman I'm having sex with, who else was she with? Or does his, what to measure up to my
mm-hmm.
side? I've never thought of these things. I don't know who thinks of that during the act because the act is pleasurable and exciting. I don't know who's thinking of that during it. But now, to close this out, is that do you think that there is this sort of infantile thing to the red pill? I mean, to me, it's just become a bitch and moan fest, whining, yammering, complaining, and all they do, if you see them in their videos, I don't know what they have to offer at this point. Maybe in the beginning, when we had the 1.0 guys like Paul Elam and Stardust, there was much important things to offer the public, but now it's just simply on repeat, like echolalia. I mean, like, should I take half my stuff? The carousel, the monkey branching, over and over and over again. And also, they tend to have, not tend to, they do have an utterly hostile view on women. Everything that they post,
Mm-hmm.
most of what they post is utterly hostile to women. So my view, and also what I posted underneath their posts is, well, they're saying women are terrible. Why are you exhorting men to get them? Why? I've asked them, well, according to your logic, women are terrible. Wouldn't it make sense to disassociate completely? Do you see this incongruence? I believe that these people have literally nothing to offer men at this point. Literally nothing. They have nothing to offer to civilization, to child raising, marriage, nothing. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was a big fan of the red pill movement early on. I wasn't really online at the time, but I definitely saw the benefits of some of the things. And I think that at this point we've gotten to a situation like you said, they're almost like black pill at this point. They're very nihilistic. They're very women are evil, which to me is very silly because women can't be evil. Men and women are clearly created as two separate parts of one species.
Yes.
We're made to be complementary pairs. We're made to mate with one another and raise offspring. And so for one of us to be, inherently evil would not make any sense. And so, the men who kind of think that way are really not thinking all the way. They're really not thinking about the full picture. They're really not thinking about the real logistics of it. But also, like you said, they're very negative, and I'll get this a lot. I'm trying to help and I'm trying to understand, and I really do enjoy learning male perspectives, because I think that it's beneficial, because otherwise I'm just getting everything from female perspective. And so if you really want to understand an entire situation or an entire issue, you have to really try to see things from all aspects, from both sides. And you know you will have these red pill people that are just kind of like encouraging men to use women.
Yes.
And to me, that is counterintuitive, because the whole problem, the way that the reason that feminism has gotten to the point where it has, is because they were able to kind of bounce off this idea of men using women for personal gratification. And so if you're feeding into that whole idea and really creating this movement based off of, being a pickup artist, or based off of using women for personal gratification, you're only feeding into that issue. And so personally, I think that the solutions are going to be, mutual. They're going to have to be include both male and female perspectives. They're going to have to include both men and women working together to kind of understand these things better, to understand the dynamics and why we have the issues that we have, and how everything's has kind of gotten how everything has kind of gotten off the rails. Because if you are just trying to solve issues with one perspective, you're never going to get to the end, because it does involve both of us. It does involve a mutual respect that we need to find and we need to have. And I was actually just talking the other day to someone about this, as far as you're not going to find very many virginal women in the modern generations. You're
Right.
just not. And so, whereas I totally understand the low body count desire, and I think that that's something that you should definitely have your standards on that, because women with higher body counts, they're going to probably not going to be able to pair bond very well. They're not going to be able to stay in a relationship and have that kind of stick to itiveness that you need for someone to build a life with. But at the same time, if someone's been with like a handful of people, you're not going to you can't just kind of discount them because they aren't virgins, because
Right.
we
Exactly.
have this huge issue where I got into this, a lot of it because of the male loneliness epidemic and the high suicide rate and things like that. And I really saw where men were just kind of checking out, and men were saying, this isn't worth it anymore for us. And so, you have to kind of work with the other people to figure out what the issue is and how we're going to solve it. And I don't think that this issue is going to be solved by, virginal women. I think it's going to be solved by normal women who realize that they've made these mistakes, who realize that they have been living a way that is not good for their mental health, as well as the future of their possible family, and really trying to kind of counterbalance that, or maybe make up for that, or figure it out. And you have this whole, the way that the red pill community has kind of gone, is to just shame women for not having kept their virginity, or shame women for falling into the trap of feminism and sexual uh, liberty. And that's really going to just work against finding solutions and finding answers. So whereas I think that women should definitely have to answer for their past discretions, I really don't, or indiscretions, I really don't think that that the answer is to use and abuse the women that you do meet. So
Yes, I agree. Now, one side topic, and then we're going to go into the solutions.
I'm gonna have to, I have
Okay.
to get off here. I gotta go pick my daughter up, so
Okay.
I
Okay.
gotta kind of wrap this up. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Yes. Okay. Perhaps we could talk about the solutions aspect in another conversation.
Do what? I'm so sorry. What?
Perhaps we should discuss the other topic of solutions in a different video.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.